Good afternoon. My name is Ihang Yang, and I'm speaking to you from New York City at the Juilliard School, where I teach. And it's so wonderful to welcome you back to the International Fortepiano Salon. This is our 24th Salon episode, if you can believe it. I thank you again for being part of our online community, which was created during COVID to foster connection in the early piano world. It is so wonderful to know that our community keeps growing, and you, the audience, are the most vital part of keeping these connections alive in music and in our passion for early music and early pianos. We have a truly fascinating episode today. And I'm so thankful to Catskill Mountain Foundation and their wonderful staff for making these programs happen. It is spring, and we are celebrating Women's History Month here at the International Fortepiano Salon. I could not be more excited to welcome our guest today, Karin Cuellar, who is a distinguished scholar and violinist and board president of Early Music America. She's going to be giving us a wonderful presentation, and we're going to be listening to historical recordings around the topic of women in South America. Now I want to introduce my co-host, Patricia Garcia-Gill. Hi, Patricia. How are you?
Hi, Jigen. I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the Catskill Mountain Foundation and the staff, of course, for making this possible. Thank you, Karin, for being here, ready to connect. And just well, I'm connected from Ithaca, New York. And I am very, very, very glad to welcome Karin Cuellar Rendon. Just to say something else about her, she is amazing performer of violin, but also an amazing scholar, currently residing in Montreal, Canada. But she performs all over the world. She's the founder of the Jimenez Quartet, and she was recently appointed artistic director of the International Baroque Music Festival Misiones de Chiquitos in Bolivia. As an advocate for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in early music, she serves. She's as co-chair of Early Music America Idea Task Force, and also, as you said, Yichen, as the director of Early Music America. She also serves as artistic director of Classique Inclusive, an initiative and the initiative of Ensemble Caprice that won the 2024 Prix Opus Montreal Inclusion, Diversity. Her research focused on performance practices in South America in the first half of the 19th century, using as a case study the music of Peruvian composer Pedro Jiménez Abril Tirado. In this episode, as you mentioned, she will be celebrating Women's History Month, and will introduce us to pianist-composers who revolutionized music in South America: Brazilian Chiquinha Gonzaga, Bolivian Modesta Sanjines, and Venezuelan Teresa Careño. She will be talking about the way their fascinating lives and very inspiring lives and music intersected with politics, and in particular, how they contributed to the nation-building efforts in the 19th century in Latin America. So welcome, Karin Cuellar Rendon.
Yes, thank you so much. And I forgot to tell everyone, Patricia and Karin, to ask our live audience right now to say hello, as we always do in the comment box. So if you're tuning in now live, please say hi in your YouTube or Facebook comment box and say where you're viewing from. We're so happy to have you. And at the end of the presentation, at the end of this hour, you will have the opportunity also to type in any questions that you have for our guest. Thank you. Okay, now to you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Jigen, and thank you so much, Patricia. For me, it's a pleasure to be here today to share a topic that is so dear to my heart, which is music composed in South America. But especially today, since we are celebrating Women's History Month, we are going to celebrate 3 women composers from the 19th century in South America. We are going to start by giving you a broad historical context. Next slide, please. So what brought us to the 19th century when these 3 composers lived? And we are also going to go a little bit beyond the 19th century to put a full context before and after our composers. So In the beginning of the 19th century, music composition and music production was affected by what happened in the last decades of the 18th century. And these include the Bourbon reforms of the late 18th century, around 1790, which is when the crown in Spain decided to open the ports in Spain, the ports in Lima, to the circulation of written sources. This included music, this included texts, this included a lot of the ideals of the Enlightenment being transferred from Europe to the Americas. So then these reforms, what they allowed is that there was more open circulation of these materials, more open circulation of knowledge as well, and the arrival of many instruments to the Americas. We know that also in the last decades of the 18th century, Napoleonic advances in Europe was changing the landscape in Europe, and that one of those was the move of the King of Portugal to Brazil, instaurating the empire in Brazil. And so then when we study music composing this in this period, then we need to take this into consideration. So now we are talking about the first decades of the 19th century. And this is when most of the countries that were previously under colonial rule, both Spanish and Portuguese, Spanish in all of the territories that you see in the map as green, and Portuguese in the territories that are marked as yellow. During colonial rule, the colonial structure for music production was centered in the cathedrals, in the character of the chapel master. The chapel master was the composer that was elected by the crown and by the authorities to represent and to cater to colonial needs, both religious and secular. So then every cathedral in the main cities in colonial territories in the Americas had an orchestra, had a main composer, and most of these, most of the music production was concentrated in these spaces, the cathedrals. But then what resulted from this is that both indigenous peoples and slaves and their musical traditions were resulted to be peripheral to the colonial interest. During colonial times, and this is something that is part of history, so we need to mention it, indigenous peoples and slave peoples too, up to maybe mid-18th century, were not allowed to enter the cathedrals, were not allowed to enter the churches. So then they did not have access to this music production. And also they were not part of that musical landscape. It is within the 18th century that more mixed race composers and mixed race musicians enter the workforce in the cathedrals, being part of the orchestras, and then eventually becoming chapel masters at the late 18th century. So this is to give you an idea of what was happening in the 18th century towards the 19th century. Next slide, please. So then after this period, we encounter the age of revolutions, which roughly went from 1790s to the 1850s. And this is when most countries fought for their independence. Now, the spaces where music production took place, besides the church, we had the theaters and we also had the salons, a very special space for music production that we will be talking about more later. So now the genres were included masses, included patriotic songs, included national anthems, theater music in the form of tonadillas, that was an imported genre from Spain. We also find repertoire from this period as symphonies, and we also find vocal and instrumental chamber music. So while in the previous century, when colonial forces and colonial needs needed to be catered Most of the production was sacred music in the form of masses, in the form of shorted chamber music, but mostly to be used for religious purposes. We see that in the first decades of the 19th century towards the rest of the 19th century, other genres enter the musical soundscape. Next slide, please. So then what do we find at the birth of the republics? I didn't mention, but in the map before, that in the slide before, you were able to see the year of every single country gaining independence. And this happened between 1816 towards 1830s. So it's in the first decades of the 19th century where the republics were born in South America. But what happened during this period is twofold. There is in one side, a necessity to be part of the globe, a necessity to be part of the rest of the world. So then a cosmopolitan, a need and a craving for a cosmopolitan style rather than distinctive local traditions. So then a composer in South America during these first decades of the 19th century was finding itself trying to negotiate between the local aesthetics and rhythms and styles, but also being part of the global narrative, being part of a list of composers that were part of this cosmopolitan style. So then this, for example, is an approach that I like to take from post-colonial theory, which is to elevate composers based on their own historical context. So while we are going to be talking about the 20th century music nationalism, when we really make an effort to elevate local traditions, in the beginning of the 19th century, there is this negotiation. Yes, we want to gain independence from colonial rule. Yes, we want to be different from Europe, but we are also individuals in a cosmopolitan world. So then we are composers also within this cosmopolitan style, cosmopolitan aesthetic, cosmopolitan sound. So then there are two things that happen. There are state ceremonial music production, which included European military music and Italian opera. And this is the part that is trying to cater to the cosmopolitan need to be part of the rest of the world. So then we see the resurgence of national anthems as countries gain independence and they want to be part of the world, but also be their own distinctive selves. And I will leave this as homework for our audience to go and search for some of the national anthems of South America. I would recommend the Uruguayan national anthem, but you can also hear Bolivian or Argentinian or any South American national anthem. You will hear strong influence by Italian opera in these national anthems. It will sound totally like Rossini to you, like a Rossini. Totally a Rossini language in these national anthems. So then what happens is that these anthems do not come to distinguish each country from another, but come to cement this idea of legitimacy and sovereignty, which is based on similarity with other emerging states rather than difference. And next slide, please. And this is something that we have in one hand, but on the other hand, we also have this negotiation that composers are doing of being part of the world. We are part of these very new nations, but we are also trying to find and determine what is Americano, what is so unique of us. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were no talks yet about what was Peruvian or what was Brazilian or what was Argentinian. It was what was Americano about all of what we were doing. This was found in pamphlets. This was found also in books, in compositions. Pedro Jiménez Abel Tirado, the composer I researched, he wrote a valse in 1825 called Valse en Estilo Americano, Valse in the Americano style. And in this valse, you can hear some Andean sounds, some Andean sonorities that are very, very local to what is now Peru. So then we have this negotiation. This concept of nation then was linked with being Americano, with being in this continent, the American continent, el continente americano, in the beginning of the 19th century. And it's not until the mid-20th century that we find all of this negotiation to be solidified in what we will later call the 20th century music nationalism movement. And this is what Thomas Turino, in his article Nationalism in Latin American Music, defines as a somehow unified sociocultural entity, which is found maybe by the mid-20th century. Turino also identifies in this way two types of musical nationalism that was built into the 20th century: the state-generated and elite-associated, and the reformist popular, or folklorization of indigenous and African American traditions. This is all 20th century. Next slide, please. So then, why are we talking about 20th century now? It's because our three composers, the ones that we are going to hear about today, they pave the road from colonial times towards the 20th century music nationalism as we know it today. But what has happened, which is very peculiar, is that the 19th century has not been yet fully researched as has been the 20th century, for example. And so then using the music by these three composers as a link can inform us about what happened in the process of starting in a period where most of the music was produced, composed, and catered to Europeans and to European tastes. And then towards a whole century, or through a whole century, then we arrived in the 20th century music nationalism movement. So then in the 20th century, what we find, and this is also coming from the governments, is more populist movements that include, that have notions of nation that are more inclusive, which include formerly disenfranchised social groups like indigenous peoples, mestizos, African descents, and their cultural products and their music. So then in this way, in the 20th century, from the government, culture is being used as a unifying force, now trying to be Brazilian, Peruvian, Bolivian, very distinctive from another country. So then we have this modernist reform, or the folklorization of indigenous and African American traditions, which involves the fusion of local, non-cosmopolitan instruments, sounds, and genres with a largely cosmopolitan aesthetic, stylistic, and contextual frame. Next slide, please. So then it is in the 20th century that Thomas Turino defines musical nationalism as, quote, music used for any nationalist purposes, used to create, sustain, or change an identity unit that conceives of itself as a nation in relation to having its own taste, as well as for state or nationalist party purposes in relation to creating, sustaining, or transforming national sentiment. We find that this definition emphasizes the use and effect and does not connect style or motivation, which is something that we are going to talk later on when we talk about our specific composers. It's only in the 20th century where we see the national sentiment, this idea of music nationalism, come to operate across cultural differences, something that we didn't see in the 19th century and we didn't see in the 18th century.
This is really fascinating so far, Karin. I'd love to know more about salons, as we're sort of in a virtual 21st century salon now. What was it like in the salon culture of this place and time period that you're focusing on?
Yeah, and this is a great question. Thank you so much, Ihem, because the salon, both in the 19th century and later on in the 20th century, became the space, one of the key spaces where countries, were newly formed countries or pre-formed countries, found their identities. These were spaces where political debate took place, where cultural encounter took place, where you would find during the age of revolutions, during the wars of revolutions, people were still holding salons. And so then we see the resurgence of patriotic songs being composed for the salon in the first decades of the 19th century. We found music composed for the salon. So then formerly disenfranchised groups, say like enslaved or mixed race or women in this case, were part of the music production. As you can see in these two paintings from Claudio Gay, is a Chilean painter. And these are two paintings from the 1840s. The one in the left is supposed to be depicting a tertulia, a salon gathering in 1840s. And we see a woman sitting at the piano. And the painting on the right is a painting from 1844, but it's supposed to be depicting a tertulia in 1790s, where we also see a woman at the piano and playing other instruments also. Many women there. Colonial society was very restrictive towards minorities and also women. So then women didn't have the chance to be a chapel master. Women didn't have the chance to be part of the orchestras at the cathedrals. So women didn't have the chance to be part of the musical nor landscape nor soundscape in the city, right, in the society. But then with the creation of salons and salon gatherings, then we see the creation also a space for women to be themselves through music, to be composers, to be performers. And I find that it's very timely also to mention the piano as an artifact of gathering. The whole society is gathering around the piano, and entire wars were fought and designed or like strategized around a piano. So, and national anthems were composed around the piano. So it's that crucial space where not only music was created, but also whole national identities were created during this time.
Yeah, it's a powerful symbol in itself, or you say an artifact, the piano. We see a square piano from 1790, the drawing there, and then a sort of an upright, a long decorative piano with candelabras. And just it's so wonderful to hear about this kind of salon taking place in South America in the 18th and 19th century. And there's been many studies done recently by some of our friends here at the International Fortepiano Salon, like Rebecca Sipis, about how salons in Europe itself were liminal spaces, or spaces where women had cultural agency and were actually the agents of political and artistic development and discussion. For example, Madame Briand, who hosted Benjamin Franklin when he was trying to get funding in Paris for the American Revolution. She was she was the reason he loved being in Paris, and he loved hearing her play the piano and make music. And I know later you're going to be talking about piano, so just the meaning of the piano itself as an object. Its ability to be a vehicle for the salon culture and open discussion, but also that it's a Western European instrument and what that means. But I'm sure I would love to hear from you about that, but I don't want to keep us stuck here for now. We can keep going. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. I was just kind of jumping off of what you're saying. But this is all great. Yeah.
Maybe next slide, please. Yeah, so then now we come to talk about our three composers and how also they use their agency as women. They reduce agency as women, but they subverted whatever societal expectations were placed for them, and how they also use the salon as a space for subversion and for creativity. So Chiquinha Gonzaga is one of those very special cases. She lived in Rio de Janeiro during the second reign of Pedro II. She was an independent musician. She was the first female conductor in Brazil. She's known widely for synthesizing African music into her compositions. And she was a crucial figure in the development of the choro, a uniquely Brazilian genre. She composed around 77 plays and operettas and around 200 salon pieces for piano. Something very unique about her life, and why I mentioned that she was an independent musician. She was the daughter of a white, very highly positioned military member and a mixed race mother. In Brazil, in the late 19th century, women were often seen as it's a quasi slave role. Few of them dare to defy their parents or husbands. And if they dare to do that, they were quickly sent to reformatories or convents. But at the beginning of the 19th century, or the first decades of the 19th century, with the arrival of the royal family in Brazil, there was a little more, there was some opening. So then women began to be seen more in the streets, dancing in receptions, going to the opera and going to theater. And Chiquinha was an independent musician because she did not want to stay under the control of her first husband, which was chosen for her by her father. So then she left her husband and asked for a divorce, which became a scandal at the time. And she took one of her sons, her eldest son, and was not allowed to take the two younger children. But she was able to leave the husband with his son, and by doing that, of course, she was declared dead and by her father. So then she was casteized because she dared to follow her own path. And she then started playing the piano at music instrument stores. She gave piano lessons to support her family, and she was able to participate in salon gatherings, in balls, in what it was called in Brazil chorãos, which are reunions, normally reserved for men. But because she was so good and so famous, then they invited her. She started playing with a flutist, a very famous flutist from this period, with whom she started a group called O Choro do Calado. And she was the first woman to play in this group, and this first woman to play as chorãos. So then we find that in this period, because of the chorãos, these gatherings that were more popular, say it was for people, it wasn't for the aristocracy, she found a need to adjust the piano sound to the popular taste. Then this is how the choro comes to be developed. And so one of her first compositions that was a hugely success was the polka Atraente in 1877, which we will hear in a second. And she composed it as an improvisation at a choro meeting, and then became very popular. One of the most widely known anecdotes of her life, and to also try to give a glimpse of her rebellious nature, is that she had a friend, Nair de Tefe, who married the Brazilian president Hermes Rodrigues da Fonseca, and therefore she became the first lady. So in 1914, she was invited to a salon gathering hosted by the president and the first lady, where she premiered Corta Jaca, which is another piece that we will hear in a second. But this was considered a scandal. Corta Jaca is a choro. And so then the public critics of the government, went to the newspapers to say that vulgar music, vulgar dances from the people were not supposed to be performed at the palace. So then they were criticizing the government of this president for disseminating popular music, for disseminating the music that had vulgar origins, and did not follow aristocratic and social elite protocols. So then, we see that even as just by being herself, she was subverting what society was expecting from her. subverting what even the elite or the societal model was expecting from any other composer. And so then she gave us the most fascinating music, which now we will hear. We will hear Atraente and Corta Chaca. Beautiful music. In the first recording, we heard Chiquinha Gonzaga playing herself at the piano. So we move on to our second composer, Modesta Sanjines Uriarte. She was Bolivian. She lived in La Paz. She was one of the most known 19th century Bolivian composers and also known for synthesizing local genres into her compositions, in this case, Andean styles. She composed around 50 pieces for piano and worked as a journalist, writing articles to benefit women. She was also a philanthropist. In her philanthropic work provided social services for the elderly, orphans, and poor. She also helped build hospitals, and she used her musical talents to raise funds to assist the wounded and prisoners of war during the War of the Pacific. It was a war at the late 19th century between Bolivia, Chile, and Peru over the control of the Pacific coast, which eventually Bolivia lost. So Chile gained the control of the Pacific coast. But her work goes beyond music, and this is something that is very special about Modesta Sanjines, is that she was able to find and to create spaces for her own existence within Bolivian society. The costumes in this century were still that restricted education only to men, to the children that were men were the only ones that went to school. But fortunately, Sanjines' parents enrolled her into a school for women that was just newly created, and that's where she learned music and other subjects. And she chose not to marry, also not following societal expectations, because she wanted to use her life and use her time to help others. And so then she also, when she lived the rest of her life, maintained her own home without having to move with her brother, which it was customary in Bolivian society in that period, to always live with a male figure. In her music, we will be able to hear some of these nationalistic elements, patriotic elements, which are themes, recurring themes within her music, even though she studied all the European composers. But that was her focus. And that's why we call her a proto-nationalistic composer, as well as Chiquinha Gonzaga. She was also able to found the Philharmonic Society of Bolivia in 1863. And she created, before she died, she created a endowment where she left all of her bequest to all the women that she employed, family and friends, with a specific note that the funds were to be given to women to become their own source of earnings for necessities and education, free of any male intervention. This way also, trying to subvert the expectations of the time. We are now going to hear one of her pieces, her composition Recuerdo de los Andes, Memories from the Andes. And for this recording, we thank Bolivian pianist Mariana Landia. And we come to our final figure of today, Teresa Careño. She may have been the most famous out of our three pianist-composers showcased today. She was born in Caracas, but lived all over the world. Is one of the most renowned 19th century Venezuelan pianists and composers. She was also a singer and a conductor, and composed around 75 works for solo piano, voice, and piano, choir, orchestra, and instrumental ensembles. She had a 50-year concert career. She became an internationally renowned virtuoso pianist and was often referred as the Valkyria of the piano. Her father was the son of Jose Cayetano Carrero. He was a very important Venezuelan composer. So she was born into a musical family. It was also her father who became her first teacher and also oversaw her career until his death in 1874. His family, noting that Teresa was so talented, decided to move to the US. They emigrated to New York City, where she had her debut at Irving Hall at the age of 8 years old. And so then she toured the US. She was even able to play for Abraham Lincoln at the White House in the fall of 1863. She left the United States for France, so then she could continue her studies there, also having a debut at the Salle Erard. And so then she toured the whole world as a famous pianist. While she lived in Paris, and she met prominent musicians who also composed dedicated pieces for her. Rossini, Matthias, Chopin. Matthias was a student of Chopin, Charles Gounod, and Franz Liszt. Teresa Careño became one of the most renowned Venezuelan artists of the century, and something that she may have done that our previous composers did not get to do was to record CDs. And she recorded various albums, and she recorded many composers, but she also recorded some of her compositions. And we are now going to hear one of these compositions. It is The Little Valse, and this was recorded in a Velte Mignon piano roll recording.
Thank you, Karin, for sharing this beautiful, beautiful music. And I'm always like fascinated on how these piano rolls like well sound is like incredible how they can capture all this like power and richness of the instrument. And it made me wonder if you know or you want to talk a little bit more about the pianos that she might have had access to. I suppose that she while traveling the world, she must have tried many different kinds of pianos, especially 19th century pianos from many different piano builders in Europe. But I'm even more curious if you might know which pianos she might have had access to when she was in Venezuela as a kid.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the pianos, the instruments that all of them could have used or may have used. I was able to find this picture of Chiquinha Gonzaga around 1930s, and we can see an upright piano, full-on English piano, we presume. Um, Next slide, please. But for example, for the case of Bolivia, we don't have any painting of Modesta Sanjines at the piano or picture at the piano. But then there is this instrument at the Casa de la Libertad. It's a museum in Bolivia, where there is a square piano of 5 octaves. Next slide, please. And most of her compositions, and also the compositions of Peruvian composer that I researched, Pedro Jimenez Retirado, only get to they actually use the range of the 5 octaves, some maybe 5.5. So presumably they could have had access to square pianos like these ones. And this is a piano. It, the label is not clear, so we don't know what is the manufacturing of this instrument. But most likely it was an English instrument. I was able to find documents in the library in Lima, and also documents in the cathedral in Bolivia, in Sucre, where there are receipts of purchases of instruments that, and when there are references to pianos, then there are references to English pianos. It doesn't say what brand, what maker, but I'm talking about mid 19th century. So this could have been one of those instruments that she could have had access. In the case of Teresa Careño, for example, next slide, please. Well, we see her, at 10 years old, already having a full, full-on piano. And next slide, please. And in this picture of her later in her life, and also from this concert program, we can see that she had access to an Steinway. And the concert program is fascinating to me because, well, one, we see what she played. It was a concert in Havana in 1917. But also in the concert program, there is like an ad for a Steinway piano and the prices of all the 3 pianos that they had available. So it's, it's quite fascinating to see that. So then Teresa Carreño most likely had access to later instruments, to better instruments, bigger instruments, as she was able to travel the world. But it wasn't the same case for Chiquinha Gonzaga or Modesta Sanjines, who did not get a chance to leave their countries.
Yes, thank you. It was really fascinating also to see the images of the tertulias because, that the one of the image from the Chilean tertulia seems an English instrument as well, I think. And so the one that is a later one on the picture that you had next to it, it seems like a cabinet piano, an English one. I don't know what you think. You can.
Yes, yeah, most likely. It seems like that was the preferred style of pianos that were in South America, or at least from those documents that I was able to access in Lima, from the port of Lima, the imports of the instruments. Most of the pianos that arrived there were English pianos.
And can you talk about who was purchasing and importing these pianos from England to these places, and how, who are the general clientele in that? Yeah.
That's why I presume that most of the instruments that people had access were either square pianos or upright pianos, and not full-on bigger size instruments. One, because of the price also, but they were instrument houses or instrument stores in Peru, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Chile, in the 19th century, and there was a boom for I guess salon gatherings. So then, of course, at this point, we have to mention that yes, it would only have been someone that would have the means to purchase a piano. But because of that, then they were these instruments were the ones that were mostly sought, the pianos that were, I guess, the cheaper instruments, the smaller instruments.
Hmm. Wonderful. So, can you talk a little bit more? I know when we chatted before the salon about this research into the sale of earlier pianos through Lima, and what kind of pianos you were able to see written about.
Yes. So in my research in the library of Lima, then I was able to see um, the import of these instruments, the reference to the instruments that were imported. I was actually looking for mostly for string instruments to see what was arriving. When would they have been able to import later style instruments like classical, transitional, even romantic? But then what I find throughout my research in organology, including keyboards, is that yes, there was a very long, maybe a 40-year lapsus between the transfer of the latest instrumental technology produced in Europe to arrive to the Americas. And this is due to many different reasons. Also, it takes months, I guess, or a year to go in a boat, or it took, to go in a boat from Paris to all the way to Lima. But also the accessibility to these instruments and the financial power that families had. Now, another element, and that's why I think that earlier pianos were used even later in the century, is that these were big investments for families, even if they were not part of the aristocracy, but they wanted to have a piano, then they were able to pay to buy a piano in installments. So then they will have these big investments, say like having a car later, in the 20th or 21st century. So then this instrument would become like a staple of the family, and the families that had a piano were very well seen. And they will inherit, the piano will be an artifact that will be inherited through generations and generations and being used, for more years than maybe we would have thought that they could have been used in Europe. As they were already creating new models, then there was no much need for those, because then families that had the financial power to purchase them, they were still using what they had inherited from maybe a generation before. So then we encountered that maybe by mid 19th century, still square pianos with 5 octaves are being used in South America. So only in the case of Teresa Careño, for example, I think that it's very peculiar because she left Venezuela. So then she was able to access different instruments, more, up-to-date instruments than the ones that Modesta Sanjines had access in Bolivia or Chiquinha Gonzaga in Brazil.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Karin. I've learned so much, and the music is so beautiful from all three composers. We're at the end of our hour, but we have a few minutes. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. And if not, Patricia and I'm sure I'm bursting with questions for Karin. Patricia, you want to go ahead?
I wanted to know, no, this organology research is fascinating to me. And what you're saying about having like outdated instruments and how that really reflects in the music that was written is also very, very revealing. I was wondering if you were able to find any instruments built in any of those countries, so either Bolivia or Venezuela or Brazil, because I know from some research I've done myself, the first one I was able to find that was made in the colonies was made in Mexico in 1793, or maybe before, but this is the reference that we have on a journal. So do you know, like, if this happened around that time in these other countries or later?
What
or
I know
at
is
all?
that in Argentina was the first one to try to actually build instruments. But what I understand is that they were putting them together, back together. So they would import the parts and then put it back together. But there is not much reference to these instruments outside of Argentina. So it seems that they were catering local markets. I'm talking about 1840s through our towards 1860s. Yeah, so then there was a boom of during this period was a boom of opera, right? So then everyone wanted to sing their latest opera at home in a home version, and so then of course there was a need for pianos, and it seemed like in Argentina specifically that I didn't see this happening in other places as a phenomenon. There was more need for pianos, so the demand was bigger than the offer. So then this is maybe out of need that makers thought of doing that. But the, up to date, there is no industry that has carried over. So we don't have the instruments to actually say with certainty when were they made and how did they sound, etc. But I know that Argentina had efforts, or they pursue efforts of building instruments, or at least like assembling them together.
Thank you.
I have a question, and if we don't have any questions from our audience, this may be our final question. But sort of to jump off from this wonderful presentation, I love, Karin. At some point, you were talking about, I think, Uriarte, and saying just by being herself, she was subverting societal expectations and norms, or something of that. I'm paraphrasing what you said, and I love that so much. That hearing what these women composer pianists accomplished, they were really true to themselves, and they were negotiating societal norms and cultural expectations. So based on what you're studying right now, researching so in depth, what encouragement, what is your own story within all of your research? And I would love if you want to share with other women and underrepresented groups, minorities in early music and early keyboards especially, which is our forum here today, about where our practice of Western European music and piano playing and keyboard playing. How do we negotiate that with our desire to express and know our unique identities? What kinds of thoughts do you have as you do all of this rigorous scholarship and about specific groups of women or places they come from?
Yeah, and this is a great question, Jihen. Thank you so much. Because without knowing and without wanting, we tend to exoticize ourselves and exoticize composers too, right? Trying to
Mm-hmm.
find what makes them different as opposed to trying to place them in a longer narrative. And this is the part that I take from post-colonial theory, which is talking about composers without comparing them, without comparisons, without or finding ways to talk about composers that would not compare them to any other, either male or European, if in the case of South American composers. And without then by doing that, trying to uh, move forward and move very far from exoticizing oneself and the composer and the music. So then um, what this means is that we can be, say, Bolivian playing Bach. It doesn't need that because I'm from a certain specific region in the world, I need to only perform music from that region. But it also means that within my own identity, I'm able to research topics that may be closer to my identity and be able to elevate them in a way that is respectful, not exoticizing, not tokenizing. So it's a fine line that we have to walk by, because it's I think it's easier to try to find the differences, or try to find what makes us unique, or makes us, yeah, quote unquote exotic. So this is something I fight against a lot within my own work, my own research, and in my own field too, because yes, we want to be more diverse, we want to be more inclusive, and we want to explore repertoires from different parts of the world, and we want to make sure that our students are also exposed to many different cultures through the music that they are learning and that we are teaching. But in that way, we also need to be careful of making sure that these cultures are represented fairly, are not compared. And this is something I always go back. Many scholars in the past century, have used this comparison as a way of making a product more interesting. Say, the composer I researched, it used to be called the Mozart of the Americas, or the Rossini of the Americas, or, there are so many Mozarts, like colored Mozart. I don't want to go into specific, but yeah, I remember with Pour Bologne, Chevalier de Saint George, how we started mentioning him. And so these are the parts that I personally am very careful about, and try to be very judicious about that I don't compare. I don't use comparison as a way of measuring. I try to just elevate the composers, or elevate the music or the practices with their own means and their own value and their own, success. And the same thing goes to myself and what I do. And because what I do in whatever field, either if it's in research or in performance, and it's going to be a reflection of who I am. But I'm not better or worse, or specifically special because I am Bolivian, or I am whoever, or from wherever. So I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just a lot of ideas that float in my mind when yeah, I try to also make spaces for my own existence within my field. Yeah, and the spaces that we create for ourselves will be different from one to another, and our needs are different too, and what we need to express will be also different. So then it's very peculiar to each of us.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful to have this time with you to learn about your work and how you're asking these questions. It's wonderful to know of your work and your musicianship, and it gives us encouragement on how we keep going with what we do, and learning music, programming music, playing it, teaching it. We've really had our minds opened. I wanted to announce to our audience that we have 2 salons coming up, just to have in mind. Malcolm Bilson will be visiting with us on April 27th in a special salon dedicated to his just being with him and hanging out with Malcolm Bilson, who's been one of the mentors for many of us here in the early piano world. And then on May 18th, we have a salon dedicated to musicians and pianists of the Asian diaspora in early music. So we have some wonderful guests, including Hilda Huang, who is a returning guest artist from the salon. But thank you so much, Karin Cuellar, for visiting with us today and for sharing this rich history of the 3 composers. I'll be going back myself and listening to the selections you shared today, and looking for the scores. I hope they're all publicly available and published.
Yes.
And learning some of this music myself. Thank
Great.
you so much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very